I really look forward to being here with you over the next 4 months and teach you various aspects of my research. And I think today you will get a good overview of what to expect. As Stefan just mentioned, I come to you from the imperial city of London. From Great Russell Street, which is in the center of the city, where not only my office at the German Historical Institute is located, but also the British Museum, which is a so-called universal museum where world cultures are preserved. And it's because of that I think the British Museum really is a good place to start a lecture series on global history. So except that these world cultures in the museum, they are and were not exactly and always preserved here. In fact, sometimes they were also destroyed, or at least they were not very well looked after. And it is exactly that tension, how the preservation and the destruction of heritage and material culture, and also, therefore, the potential historical knowledge that is attached to them, that is really what stands at the heart of my talk today, and the seminars that I will give over the course of the next 4 months. But let's go back to Great Russell Street. Some of you might have heard in the news that in mid-August, the British Museum has been questioned over the theft of up to 2,000 objects from its collection by an internal curator. For long, in particular in the context of repatriation of artifacts, Western museums have argued that objects are safer in Western collections. But there are really countless examples that have shown the opposite throughout the 20th century. So think, for example, of the aerial bombardment in wartime Europe. Here you have some sculptures from Tel Halaf in Syria that were destroyed and in Berlin during the wartime time. Then think of the risks of earthquakes in Los Angeles, where the Getty Museum is located. Or also, to give you a local example, the likelihood of floods in Paris due to the water that can come into the storage. And of course, there are also attacks on museums that could happen by terrorist groups, to name a few examples. One of the most famous objects in the British Museum is the Parthenon frieze. And it is the subject of a current repatriation dispute between the Greek and the British, during which the British argued that the Greeks could not actually take care of that object adequately. But Athens, you might know this, in the meantime has actually built a museum for it. In the 1930s, the museum has in fact scraped the marbles with tools which destroyed the pigments and the traces of the tool marks. So these were in fact painted. But historians of ancient Greek, and I will come back to this in a minute, have shown that temples and sculptures were not in fact white. They were richly painted. Catherine Titi, I think she's here in Paris at Paris 2, has published on what became known as the Duveen scoring scandal, which is named after an art dealer and benefactor of the British Museum. So Titi revealed Duveen's attitude at the time with this source. So Duveen ordered museum staff to go into the storage to whiten these originally polychrome sculptures by scrubbing really off these marbles. And this task, which lasted 15 months, took place in 1938. I've personally found that really interesting because that's the height of German race science, so to speak, and we'll come back to that later. An internal board concluded that the resulting damage really is obvious, quote, and cannot be exaggerated. The marbles were nevertheless displayed in the Duveen Gallery in the British Museum, which was named in the honor of the man who was responsible basically for the destruction of its historical surface. Now, museums are not just places of public knowledge making, but they are also places of secrecy. Think of the countless of items in storage we don't even know the existence of, and I will talk about this in a separate seminar, that's seminar 3. The archives of its often dubious and often colonial collection history that even historians like me may never be able to see. And of course, all the knowledge that was willingly concealed so as to not damage the reputation of the museum. The cleaning of the marbles was only exposed in 1998, so it was kept a secret for 60 years. And only then it was exposed by a British historian, who then also really proposed that these marbles, they should go back to Greece. But already at the time, it caused consternation. TT showed that a series of letters that were published in the Times as early as 1858 already expressed concerns about scrubbing of the marbles and blamed the museum for vandalism. But why did Duveen even do what he did? So Duveen showed a strong preference for the whiteness of the sculpture, as I mentioned earlier. Subhadra Dash, in a podcast on the Parthenon frieze on a website of a project that I run that you can look up if you like, she provided some clues. At the time, there was an assumed intellectual and moral and aesthetic superiority of whiteness. Debbie Chalice, whose book you can see here, explored how the theories of the Scottish anatomist Robert Knox drew a connection between the ancient Greeks, as depicted in classical statues, and the people Knox considered to be their natural descendants, lighter-skinned Northern Europeans, like, of course, the English, arguing that the ancient Greeks, like the English, were descendants of the Saxons. And then you also have this kind of discussion in Germany where Winkelmann, who you might heard of, promoted the idea that Greek and Roman sculptures was also not painted. But I mentioned earlier that until recently there was this dominant yet false belief that these works were in fact white. But not only that, there was also the belief that the ancient world itself was white. And this thought was rooted in the alignment of color with the vulgar, with the barbaric, the profane outside the civilized world. So in believing such ideologies, Duveen essentially destroyed these objects. And of course, none of this is mentioned in the gallery facts on the website. What is worse, though, is that not a sole incident happened at the museum. So there are countless examples, and this is just one, where these sculptures were actually and permanently damaged in the British Museum. So in the following, I will ask, what does it actually mean to preserve heritage and material culture from a historical angle? And how does it relate to destruction? So in this introductory lecture, I will take we will take a look at indigenous heritage practices from the 19th century, and also building questions related to current destruction and conflicts and illicit trade. I take a global angle from Asia and Europe, and it will focus on the movement in and out of today's Middle East, where archaeology and tangible heritage have always played key roles in memory foundation and nation building. So I will ask, for example, what did local resistance against colonial fieldwork and local engagement with material culture in the Ottoman Empire actually look like? How can historians move beyond a teleological narrative that always prioritizes institutionalized knowledge? What happened to ancient objects, for instance, if they did not end up as trophies in museums? So in this lecture, I will treat preservation and destruction as historical phenomena which were rarely exclusive, but rather they were connected and identified in crucial ways. And I really hope that this lecture will also give you a new historical understanding of heritage as a Western invention, which can turn out to be insightful also for contemporary heritage and museum debates that you might follow sometimes in the news. And as you can see, I will have two parts. And the first one, I will lay out the problem. And in the second one, I will suggest some methodological solutions, so to speak. It is also, as Stefan mentioned, the first of a series of seminars that will expand traditional fields of the history of museums and collecting, with colonial and global history, with science and technology studies, and cross-cultural object biographies. And at stake really are material biographies of empire. and the questions they raise not only about historical experiences, but also about the excluding mechanisms of museums and the excluding mechanisms of global history itself. So I'm on the one hand interested in creating a future in which museums create more equal partnerships with the global south in the age of repatriation, but I also see it as our responsibility as historians to repatriate history, so to speak, and develop conceptual frameworks for global history that does not always depend on Western epistemologies, or as a PhD student initiative in Florence called it, for a fairer global history. And some people would perhaps also call this the challenge of decolonization. And it is also, ironically, a concern that should really make us thinking as global and transcultural historians. I will not add captions on my slides because I want you to focus on the images, but you can ask me afterwards if you would like more information for the sources. So, the Museum of Lost Objects. I would like to take you back to Great Russell Street for a moment, this British Museum, and stay here for a while. So the news about the theft inside the museum revealed that perhaps half of the museum's 8 million items are uncatalogued. And TT, the colleague here in Paris, concludes that, quote, the lack of an inventory has certainly facilitated the theft. Of course, this poses the question of what else might have gone missing without a trace. And surely we could ask if the British Museum has not actually any clear knowledge about its uncatalogued items in the storerooms. What about the Louvre, which lists 500,000 works of art in the digital database, but do we know if this is the entire collection? We don't know. So the British Museum can't even announce the exact number of stolen objects, which is perhaps normal without an inventory, let alone identify them. And this is really also the reason why museum archives, they are always incomplete. They will not necessarily lead to more or complete transparency. You always need additional information. These archives, they can be helpful to an extent, but they are not complete. And that history of the Universal Museum as a safe haven for the material culture of a global history, is that really one we can uphold? So I would propose a different account called the Museum of Lost Objects. And it starts with the initial journey of these objects to Europe. It is a history of contingencies, of chance, or simply often of bad luck, as these objects were lost or went adrift. So we must start with a revision of the history collecting, really. In recent years, I became particularly interested in Assyrian and Babylonian artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia, which is in today's Iraq, more or less an area between these two rivers in today's Middle East. The objects, and you see some of them here, are labeled as global in most museums, or shared heritage, which works under the premise that certain objects belong to everyone. And that's a concept which universal museums often adopt for their own ends, because it means that they supposedly must not be returned. And these excavations supplied material evidence for the construction of Assyria as the ancient cradle of all races, a place that in the 19th century Europeans identified as their own prehistory. But of course, at the same time, they differentiated themselves as a modern people from the local population. Many of these people, however, did much of the digging for the Europeans, but they are rarely mentioned in these histories or sources. So I looked at how these artifacts excavated by the British were transferred and appropriated in museums of the Western world, such as the British Museum. But around 1850, the British searched not just for oil. It did not just search for the objects, they also searched for oil and for the human and biblical origins of civilization in places like Nineveh and Nimrod. So really this is a larger project, a larger imperial project we are talking about. Most books on this topic for a long time have focused on two fixed key sites: the excavation site on the one hand, the place of discovery, and the museum as the place where the objects arrive. And they also focused on single heroic key characters in these stories. So in the British Museum, you would hear about a canonical figure in the master narrative in their display, the Victorian explorer and diplomat Austen Henry Layard. And his famous publication, Nineveh and Its Remains, which really retrospectively, after it already happened, narrates these excavations as one in which excavating objects had a clear purpose, everything worked, everything was successfully integrated into the European canonical formations. And for a long time, historians really have not created a distance to this primary source. But no one, including Layard himself, was actually sent into this region with the explicit purpose of finding specific objects, nor were these excavations planned down to the minutest detail, because until around 1900, archaeology did not even exist as a formal university discipline. So Layard was certainly not an archaeologist. He was perhaps more of a middle-class student, kind of on a gap year, who stumbled upon Paul-Émile Botta's discoveries. The French were there actually first, almost by accident. And Bottat also was not an archaeologist, he was also a diplomat and also a botanist. And the history of these excavations is still mainly told as a national story of modern nation states, Britain, Germany, France, or Prussia, I would say, rather than Germany, rather than a global or colonial one, which was deeply entangled not just with the Ottoman, but also with European empires, including the British Empire, and how these empires were entangled in these spaces and were competing or helping each other. But colleagues in Turkey and elsewhere have recently really started to tell counter stories about the European excavations in the Ottoman Empire. One aspect I'm interested in this context is the question of the actual labor. The sound. The sound. Yeah, I don't hear it, but I hear it just a little bit. I wondered if there is a sound.
Sorry, because yeah. I think it can't.
Is it his one here? I can continue in the meantime. Yes, the question of actual labor, as this labor we're seeing going on here now. There is the labor of the workman and the digging. You can see there are actual people digging, and we know far too little about them. And we will return to that aspect later. But Layard and the British Museum also depended on contemporary local knowledge, such as this guy here. His name is Hormuz Razam. He was an Oxford-trained descendant of the ancient Assyrians who led some of these excavations. And he really was a Western-educated elite scholar who acted as a local informant, kind of a go-between, right? And he's an interesting case, and he raises questions about the status of characters like him who do not really follow clear-cut categories like colonizer or colonized. He's kind of in between the two. It might be considered as problematic to describe someone with his background as an interlocutor who also possessed local knowledge. But Razam really provided highly localized information, so he spoke the regional languages, but unfortunately archives reveal little to nothing about people like him. Once these objects were dug out, their excavations relied heavily on the infrastructure of the British Empire. So the transport routes through land and sea, as these Mesopotamian finds from the Middle East, where Ottoman Empire in this case, were shipped from Basra by the sea to London through Bombay in today's South Asia, India. What we see here, British India, what we see here is a truly global history, which was unthinkable without networks of transport and exploitative aspects of labor. So these travelers, antiquarians, antiquarians, naturalists and explorers really ventured into the region for a reason. British imperial forces transferred from the West Indies, today's Caribbean islands, to the Mediterranean East as a gateway to India. And the Ottoman Empire started to be heavily contested between Russia and other competing European forces. And likewise, without the transit route through India, where many of the objects first arrived with rafts, keleks they were called, before they were shipped to London, the finds would never have arrived at the British Museum. So we get a better understanding of imperial entanglements if we look at seemingly unimportant aspects, such as the logistics of transport and their deeper meaning. So the objects did not go directly to Europe, they went all the way to India first to be shipped to Britain. And in India, they did not simply pass through. So now we're here. They did not simply pass through. In her book, Sudeshna Guha looked at the shipments of antiquities of ancient Assyria from Basra, which were on their way to London in the 1840s, but they somehow got stranded in Bombay. And amongst these were artifacts that the French considered useless. In 1848, Layard accused the Bombay government, as Guha showed, of vandalism and neglect. So the source says that Layard fumed that his cargoes had sat on the docks for months, the cases had been opened, some of the antiquities were stolen, and even lectures about the objects had been given without permission and authority. Now, I find that really funny because the comment really raises important questions in relation to the scholarly authority over these finds. So Layard was outraged that the Indians dared to even give lectures about these objects. The excavations were really driven by an ideology that assumed that collecting liberated objects from barbaric hands. And they reinforced a growing sense of racial difference between those who collected Occidental and those who were collected from Oriental. And these tropes really still persist today when Western museums argue, of course, that Greece or African nations are not capable or they don't have adequate facilities to store their own heritage in the event of repatriation or the technical know-how, how to handle them. In fact, these artifacts excavated by the French and the British often also went astray or were lost in rivers during transports as they fell off rafts and nobody could save them. Sometimes they were also saved. My own archival finds in Delhi concerned a number of incidents from the 1850s, where a French report of the loss of the most part of the Assyrian marbles belonging to the French government praised British officers who helped save antiquities that were lost in the river. So such incidents allow us, firstly, to understand fieldwork as an enterprise that depended heavily on imperial politics, trade, infrastructure, and technologies. Secondly, it shows how informal colonialism in the Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East intersected strongly with the imperial infrastructure of the British Empire. And that is a fact that reinforces the point that debates on decolonization in European museums cannot be restricted to the times and spaces when European nations and empires had actual colonies. And thirdly, it also reveals how supposedly competing nations such as France and Britain were also complicit, often, rather than merely rivals in archaeological imperial endeavors. But above all, this example really brings us back to the topic of preservation and destruction. The incident mentioned above challenged the established salvage narrative in the current historiography, which promotes Western excavations and the subsequent safeguarding in museums by European forces. In other words, accounts of the actual transport and integration of the finds, I have argued, tell a very different story. So several objects went adrift in the river Tigris or elsewhere on their way. When those objects that did survive the journey finally arrived in Britain, the problems, however, only just began. Artifacts, once they were in the museum, appeared to shift between being objects of research, trophies, and curiosities. So instead of being considered enrichments of the collection, they were increasingly seen as a burden. So they were not really sure there, should they be put next to the Greek sculptures? What is this? Is this even art? Should it be next to the Egyptian sculptures? And some finds also challenged the Bible, so they did not actually match the biblical account as they were expecting, rather than confirming it. And so they just sort of locked these items away in storage. So in other words, these were really often statusless objects without any knowledge, collected without knowledge of what they actually are. And their chaotic arrival is a symptom for the serendipity that surrounded their excavation from the very outset. Other finds initially ended up in storage, and the curators were really unsure of what to do with them. And this was especially the case for the enormous collection of cuneiform tablets, which nobody could even read at the time. And even in storage, the objects sometimes lay around for years before some specialists endowed them with importance. And here we are again with our opening example of the British Museum's inability to even account for its recent thefts. For the people involved as workers, however, things were far more complicated. Razam, who helped the British Museum, might have possessed the language skills and the diplomatic knowledge to hire, say, 300 workmen to transport a winged bull down the river Tigris, or bribe the local governor. In the 1860s, the British government even sent Razam as a diplomat to Abyssinia. But after his job was done, snobbery and racism really relegated him to a mere digger, as Europeans came to frame Mesopotamia as the site both of Western civilization's primeval past, but also the contemporary barbarian other, ignorant of their meaning as symbols for contemporary Assyrian Christians like Razam, or of a distant Indian prehistorian past. Because, by the same token, the stranding of artifacts in Bombay, an accident perceived as problematic by the British, had in fact turned into a yielding encounter which contradicted narratives of indifference and disregard of the local population. Guha, on the contrary, stresses the care but also the enthusiasm for these artifacts once they arrived in Bombay. So there was an Asiatic society which initiated a display in 1846. Some further slabs gifted by the British diplomat Henry Rawlinson were marveled in the town hall and formed the basis for future collections. You can still see these objects in Mumbai today. And unlike in Britain, where some of the finds on display in the British Museum were dismissed as curiosities and not considered art, visitors in Bombay really appreciated their aesthetics. And here they were embedded into India's own search into its prehistorical past, a fact which enforces a re-engagement with objects that Western museums see as symbols of the cradle of Western civilization. Second, the museum as an excavation site. So if the museum was in fact not an organized space, but more of a place of lost objects, can we really call it the antipode of the excavation site? I don't think so. Instead, I would argue that a museum became yet another excavation site where objects almost had to be excavated again once they were organized and classified or not. And this was the case, we're now moving forward in time, even once archaeology was indeed institutionalized in the museums and academies around 1900. In 1898, for instance, the Prussian architect and archaeologist Robert Koldewey returned from an expedition in Babylon, also today's Iraq, and put 3 small colored fragments on the desk of his director. Yet it was not clear how these finds would be incorporated in existing museum taxonomies. The 3 fragments and Berlin's subsequent decision to make Babylon one of its major excavation sites led to one of Berlin's most famous tourist attraction. Who has seen this in person? Can I just ask? A few of you. So yes, so it's the Ishtar Gate and the Processional Way in the Pergamon Museum. Yes, it is. Yet it is a case it is not this photograph that I want you to look at. I want you to look at this photograph from the 1920s, because it really enables us to look at this triumphalist narrative with fresh eyes. So here you see tables covered with fragments stretching out in the arcades of a museum building. You see workers, perhaps museum curators, who are trying really to make sense of these objects. You can also, perhaps, yes, you can see the neoclassical bust on the top right, which kind of reminds the viewer of the canonical order which until then had dominated the museums in Berlin, which was classical antiquity, which was now about to be contested by an alternative antiquity embodied in the Babylonian fragments. Then World War I happened. But also, it was not clear where to fit these Babylonian fragments anyway. Anyway, they were stuck again in transit. They were stored in preliminary buildings. For a while, they stayed in Lisbon, and they did not even arrive in Berlin. And once they got there, they kind of had to find their way around the Berlin museums for a very, very long time. And the political and cultural reasons for this is, let's call it homelessness. They are manifold. Neither before nor after the start of the Great Excavation did ancient objects from that part of the world have a physical home. So this kind of antiquity wasn't in Berlin before. So they had to build a new museum for it. So there were plans for a Near Eastern museum in 1903, but they were not put into practice for a long time. So really, they stored them in a dodgy shed, in an uncanny and dark storeroom. The archive is full of these objects just kind of randomly moving around different museums and storage rooms. There's also talk about the director looking for this supposed new museum, which at one point they said they had opened, but he could not actually find it on Museum Island. Then, during the reconstruction of the gate, many fragments, they were really keen on reconstructing these animals, did not find matching parts. So they went to a workshop in Brandenburg, which is the surrounding area of Berlin, to make matching parts, to actually make dragon and lion figures. And so that's an open secret, that many of these fragments are not even original. Meanwhile, Babylon, or the original, lived on behind the museum walls display, not on display, but behind the public museum walls, where a large number of the fragments that had not been used were kept in storage facilities. They used to be inadequate, that's the picture on the left, and now I would say they are more adequate. But we could still ask, okay, they are safe technically, but why are they actually, what are they saved for? What are they actually preserved for? They're not fitting anyway. The Iraqis don't really want them back either. They don't know what to do with them. Because ironically, various attempts were made at a reconstruction with fake tiles in Babylon, because they could not even use these other original tiles in Berlin, because they too were keen on these animal figures. So the Iraqis too used fake tiles. So objects, it seems, are often removed and collected for the sake of accumulation, to accommodate almost what can be called perhaps an anxiety of loss. But the purpose of these objects in storage is really ill-defined. And this applies in particular for objects from Mesopotamia, which was culturally appropriated by European museums to serve as symbols for the cradle of civilization. But yet these objects were too ambiguous to fit existing taxonomies easily. Now, destroying to preserve. We have so far moved from the excavation site to the museum, which in fact also turned out to be some kind of excavation site. My next example takes you back to an actual excavation site, to the ancient site of Palmyra in today's Syria. It is a designated World Heritage Site. It was not unheard of, but it was also not really on the map of mainstream tourism. So I was there before the Civil War, but I don't know many people who have actually seen the place. But then it was destroyed by Daesh in 2016, and it made it famous at once. because the loss of a building can in fact enhance its cultural significance. The Western media coverage of the damage created really this collective nostalgia and mourn, the sense of an irreversible loss of a shared material past. So this was also considered shared heritage. The Roman, multicultural Roman, a melting pot that belonged to everyone. You might remember that high-profile politicians in the Western world really quickly took sides when this debate took place. So Boris Johnson, who was then mayor of London and who incredibly later became prime minister, he personally unveiled a reproduction of this arch on London's Trafalgar Square. It later went to New York. Did it also come to Paris? I can't remember. No? It went to Abu Dhabi and to New York, I think, afterwards. So this arch was digitally developed in Oxford. It was materially manufactured in Italy from Egyptian marble. It was, in any case, a sumptuous statement of cultural authority. But what made this already disputed undertaking even more problematic was not only the high costs that were associated with it, but also the imperial setting in which it was first represented in London. So if you look, it was right between, you can't see Nelson's column here, which is an imperial memorial on Trafalgar Square, and then here in the back you see in the National Gallery. It's a museum, right? And really it stands for the idea that this is where heritage belongs, particularly if it is under threat elsewhere. So local and foreign specialists quickly united to plan the resurrection of the ancient ruins in Syria with the help of photography and 3D printing. But this is not the first time Palmyra had to be rebuilt. In 2015, the Getty Institute acquired rare early photographs by Louis Vergne in Palmyra in 1864. Sorry, the destruction was a year before, and then they acquired it, which speaks really to its audience through a nostalgia. What you can really see on this photograph is the aesthetics of the ancient ruin, which is so deeply rooted in European ideas of antiquity. What you cannot see on this photograph of the Temple of Bel is its interior. Journalists and historians, and most recently Wendy Shaw, pointed out that by the early 1900s, Palmyra had been a ruin for centuries, but that parts of it were still actually inhabited. Some buildings were used as shelters by herders and nomads, while the compound of the temple had become a small village. The vernacular architecture had survived multiple generations because it relied on layered reconstruction, also repair. So here you see women climbing up the ladder, actually repairing these structures. As a photograph from 1929. So the famous Temple of Bel, which the public now relates to destruction, was also used as an Umayyad mosque after having previously served as a church. Under the French mandate in the early 20th century, inhabitants were relocated from the ancient ruins to a new site outside of the town. So this is really French colonial history. After relocation, the new village became Tadmor, that you might also have heard in the news for being home to a notorious prison and political torture. And once these inhabitants were expelled, the village inside the ruins was destroyed to make way for the archaeological excavations and the reconstruction of the ruins of the ancient site. So Wendy Shaw's argument implies that the authenticity of the site really depends on its dissociation from both the modern people who have lived within the ruins and from the archaeologists and scholars who reconstructed it as though it had always been there like this, untouched by time. In other words, what has since then become the World Heritage Site known as Palmyra has actually begun with destruction. And this is not an uncommon feature for ancient sites such as this one. In fact, many buildings have been destroyed and rebuilt at least twice before, be it through conflict or archaeology. And what you can see here is an example of an overlooked feature of archaeology. And those of you who are archaeologists in the room, you know this, that archaeological sites which are often perceived as authentic are often already reconstructed. And secondly, an excavation often demands, of course, that buildings and archaeological histories contained within the strata above them, it must be removed or destroyed. So archaeology, in other words, and practitioners again know this, is a discipline that heavily relies on destruction. And this includes sites such as urban settlements or Islamic shrines, which are, of course, meaningful heritage to other people. So contrary to what public debates and museums often implies, there is not a Middle East or a heritage that is deemed valuable by everyone and therefore in need of saving, although media coverage and statements by academic bodies and heritage organizations often suggest that it is and that it must. So in the first part of this lecture, I have given you a few examples for the problems I would like to lay out. And in the second, shorter part, I'm more interested in alternatives and in solutions. Now, what else is preservation? Are there alternatives to museums and the UNESCO approach? Let us stick with these women for now. Repairing Palmyra. The Assyriologist Eleanor Robson has challenged the stark contrast drawn between heroic Victorian figures such as Austen Henry Layard and the image of iconoclastic barbarism often suggested by the media. Because what this simplistic view really misses out is a place for Middle Eastern professionals who have been studying this material for decades, or projects which might serve local populations as well as scholarship and the public thirst for heritage. Such views suggest that there's either the British Museum or nothing at all, but it really ignores local interest in the sites. And it is far from a more global historical analysis that recognizes cultural difference. So decolonizing antiquity collections also means to challenge the idea that the preservation of heritage depends on the widely accepted UNESCO approach, which is under criticism already. For example, preservation can come in different, even destructive guises, which go beyond official forms of excavating and the subsequent safeguarding of objects and sites. In short, heritage does not necessarily entail that objects become Western museological trophies without a function. We saw that once objects were excavated, they were not always safe on their route or also in the museum. Once they were there, museums did sometimes not even know where to put them. There has always been the problem of the influx of objects, the sheer quantity really. So let us think about whether objects might perhaps be safer underground. Could one argue perhaps that what was never excavated by 19th century European archaeologists in Mesopotamia could also not be easily destroyed by nature or humans? I'm aware of the problem of looting, but experts of ancient history actually suggested that it is the unseen objects which are the safest of all. In the case of Mesopotamia, apparently large areas of the Assyrian cities have never been surveyed or excavated, and there are millennia of archaeological deposit underneath the once standing remains on the royal citadels at Nineveh, Nimrud, Assur, or Khosabat. This is the excavation by the French, by the way. Now, I find that thought really fascinating, of dozens more winged lions still lying untouched within their earthen mounds underneath the ones that were destroyed in the historical archive of the soil. So objects and artifacts still buried in the grounds at Nimrud might be safely stored, whereas those exposed to the elements will be slowly destroyed by corrosion or human impact. In fact, an Indian case study considers burial, which is and was in the past a widespread storing practice in large parts of Asia, a legitimate means of storing and preserving objects, both historically and also still now. My colleague Apinder Singh studied an archaeological site in Kumraha near Patna, where a building an 80-pillared hall from the 2nd century BC was discovered. All that is visible on the site today are some stumps. There were larger pillars that were excavated, but they were simply too big for the locally available resources to be handled. There was nobody who could carry them. There was also nowhere to carry them to. In other words, there was no equipment. The archaeologists who discovered the pillars, they documented the objects with a photographic camera, noted the inscription, and then they buried them back in the soil. So the ground was considered a safe storage place, and archaeologists have started to challenge the idea that every single object that is dug out of the soil must enter the museological realm, where, as we saw, it might not have space anyway. So archaeologists call this the catch and release approach. They're already doing this. In cities like Paris, Berlin or London, real estate prices are currently rising. So often more than 90% of museum objects today are hidden in deep storage on the fringes of Europe's metropolitan cities, an aspect that I will go to in lecture 3. In some cases, disused industrial architecture became the new home, such as this old mine on the English countryside in Wiltshire, which is around 2 hours from London, so not exactly around the corner. It's actually really hard to get there, and once you're there, you don't know if you can actually retrieve the objects. There might not be staff to help you there because they don't have the resources. It's not their fault, there's just no resources. Kavita Singh, my co-editor, who very sadly passed away this summer, and we have done a book on these kind of topics. And we argued that, of course, there is a procedural gap between the burial in the ground and the burial in a mine. But it could be argued that the situations are actually quite similar. So burial in an often inaccessible deep museum storage is, in other words, not entirely different from burial in the soil at an archaeological site. And while this example is not historical, it does concern us as historians, because it forces us to think about the material archives that we do not see, that we do not know about, the archives in the deep storage of geological time, the earth itself, and that too is preservation. Again, what else is preservation? Little attention has also been paid to resistance against the European forces and the distinct and manifold approaches and practices towards preservation carried out by local institutions and people. But ancient objects, as Yannis Hamilakis showed, were often fully embedded in the domains of contemporary life, public space, working, farming, places of worship, houses. So they were really subject to a multi-sensory experience that was not just visual, but also tactile. So objects were reactivated multiple times and coexisted with various antiquities of different times. And moving forward in time, European archaeologists today often collaborate with local experts. There are really successful projects that take into account what do people actually need if we excavate inside. For example, destruction was also used of what is now considered heritage to reuse and thus preserve objects in new urban structures. What I find interesting is that art history as a field has a long-standing tradition in studying these practices. Spolia, they would call them. But such a framework has rarely been applied to European-dominated archaeology in the Middle East. But for centuries, in fact, unearthing ancient objects was also really widely accepted in Europe. So in early Christian times and long after, artifacts such as those from Roman temples were removed from the buildings or the soil to be recycled in churches, mosques and other buildings. A well-known example is Rome's Pantheon, a Christian conversion of a Roman building. So reworking past material, one could argue, is also preservation. It is common knowledge amongst heritage practitioners that spolia, so the material culture of previous generation, have been widely used also in post-war Germany. In both the GDR as well the FRG, when, for example, churches were reconstructed using material leftovers from World War II. In Europe, until comparatively recently, the removal of an ancient object from the ground by any non-professional citizen did not necessarily constitute a criminal act. a circumstance which shows that really that the parameters for what might be considered the right destination for ancient objects have shifted considerably in post-war Europe. So there is research that showed that in the 20th century, until very recently in Rome, people would pick up objects and use them and rebuild their home. This wasn't fine, and only with UNESCO's rise, this has become a criminal activity. And so, yes, so the example of Palmyra, of course, also showed you how heritage sites has been created by way of their own ways of preserving their heritage. But these realities, they really defy the disciplinary baggage and the canons and categories that we as historians use. And the stories are much harder to find. So how can we historians acknowledge records and sources outside of the conventional and imperial archive? Very briefly, I organized a conference a few years ago with Rodney Harrison at UCL, and I also published a paper with my colleague Trinidad Rico, where we argue that we need to move away from the imperial archive. That yes, we can use it, we must use it, we must also read it against the grain, but really we also need to think more creatively about material that speaks back or departs from these kind of sources. So sources that can enrich and diversify definitions of and access to an archive, and that can tell different stories about heritage. And the most obvious would of course be oral histories, but then we also talk about artistic practice, about conventional archives such as these of laborers, where often you do not have the names. Normally you do not have the names, and this is really a rare example here. This is a source, a 19th century, early 20th century source, also Palmyra, where the workers have left their print on payday. Doesn't give you all the names, but that's what I mean when I say counter archive. It could be in a conventional archive, but maybe we have to start looking for the sources that are not the most obvious ones, the ones that are about logistics, about payment, about transport, and then read archives differently, but also think about other forms of knowledge making, and again that is subject to another lecture. I can't go into that now. So to many, preserving certain material legacies seems an obvious and an unproblematic goal, from artifacts in museums, storage magazines to archaeological sites. And what's wrong with that? UNESCO, major museums like the British Museum, but also mainstream media really promote preservation over destruction, but this happens at the expense of a more nuanced and a potentially more effective understanding of how heritage has been determined and how it has been constructed over time from different perspectives. So current debates rarely consider that in history preservation and destruction are not necessarily opponents, but they have been collaborators in many ways. The majority of voices often equates the Orient with destruction and the West with salvage. But these are really tropes that replicate 19th century stances of imperialism. And this is where archaeology and heritage concepts really have their origin. But there is no clear-cut difference between Western and Eastern approaches of heritage to heritage. Forms of iconoclasm in both the East and the West's long history of visual and material demolition sometimes bear striking similarities. So here is one example, the toppling of Saddam Hussein and Lenin is another one, where this was a sign of political dissent, and it makes it seem unjustified to equate iconoclasm with barbarism and the appreciation of artifacts with civilization. Of course, there are also material legacies which Western history would rather see vanish. So of Nazi Germany, architecture of Nazi Germany is one example, so-called difficult heritage. And there are also current examples like that where these architectures find their continuation. Cold War heritage, lately in a heated debate discussed about the reconstruction of the Berlin Stadtschloss, which brought the destruction of the Palais de République, which was a GDR building. So this really shows that contemporary identities are negotiated and shaped in the context of material reminders of the past, but that's not always the past that everyone wishes to keep. So debating heritage without asking how this heritage has historically become heritage in the first place will lead to incomplete answers. And of course, what destruction is will also have to be historically reconsidered. It has to be de-orientalized, so to speak. Then secondly, the past is not a finite resource. The very definition of the past is contestable. There is no antiquity with a capital A. Over the past 150 years, different political regimes in both Europe and the Middle East had different preferences regarding their material legacies. And so you often have people here in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein referring back to King Nebuchadnezzar. You had Reza Shah in Persia identifying with Cyrus the Great. There are many examples like this in Europe and the Middle East. Then there's the whole issue of governments prioritizing the excavation of certain archaeological sites and neglecting others. That is, for example, the case in Israel, where it's become a powerful tool, a political tool. Of course, then there's the example of the Bamiyan Buddhas that represented negative heritage to the Taliban government. So the imagined past of an object threatened with extinction is never unrelated to an imagined future in which its preservation is potentially of value. But what counts as preservation, which objects or sites should be preserved, and how and who decides, that is unclear. And the binary between destruction and preservation still has implications today, because attacks on shared heritage may be deliberate subversions of the heritage paradigm. So this whole nostalgia actually led also to the attacks, because ISIS knew that this is preserved heritage. That is exactly why it was destroyed. And the whole material that was then acquired by museums, the exhibitions that were put on, of course, this also needs to be seen in historical context, because these are imperial tools. They were tools for mapping the Middle East. Then, thirdly, archaeology was always co-involved in colonial projects, and we will return to that in other lectures. I showed you how the Ottoman Empire functioned as a gateway to India, where people, goods and objects were on the move, developing their own history, independent of Europe. So can we envision a global history of heritage in which the Middle East serves as an angle, a center point of objects, not Europe? So global histories in the plural must be driven by a pluralist ethics and new inquiries that have their origin outside of Europe. So how would it be, instead of focusing on a transfer of objects from the Ottoman Empire to Europe, we would decenter Europe and look further east? And fourthly, can we also envision a museum history of the untaxonomized museum, the museum of lost objects beyond the salvage paradigm? And I think that point was pretty clear. It's really about seeing the museum as a constant building site, and you see some historic picture of the British Museum here, and now the most recent reconstruction of the castle in Berlin. And these episodes break the essentialist spell of the museum. It can no longer be seen as a place of seeing the world without any reflection on how the institution reframed the objects. And in Bombay we saw that the objects found unexpected meaning and were embedded in a new narrative, again independent from the European storyline. And finally, I argued that recognizing cultural diversity can lead to a different engagement with material culture, acknowledging that the groups involved had and continue to have entirely different relationships with their different constituent pasts, in which material culture was not always organized according to linear, but also to circular time. And that is, again, something that allows us to envision perhaps a different global history, one that isn't linear, one where museums and institutionalized knowledge are no longer considered an endpoint of history, but perhaps part of a problem. one where other knowledge forms count and where preservation is critically challenged and questioned. And it means going beyond concepts of progress, of modernity. It really means leaving behind the linear narrative, which takes for granted that everything leads to established scholarly disciplines and institutions, such as the museum. And so I will end here, again, with this juxtaposition, the site of Palmyra, which was destroyed already by the 1920s by the French archaeologists to turn it into a space of scholarly inquiry. But really, we should listen also to the voices of the place itself, and I brought you an oral history to finish off, and unfortunately we did a test run earlier and we cannot play it. I try it again, see if you hear it, otherwise I will quickly read it out to you.
I have a special love for Palmyra because the Temple of Bel is where my mother was born. That's before they evacuated the village from within the ruins. My grandfather was a policeman serving in Palmyra, and my grandmother, she wasn't even 20 years old when she got married and moved to Palmyra. And the Palmyrean women, they taught her how to make bread and how to cook. I hear many stories about the building, how people used the space, how children played around, including my mom. So that's what it means to me. This is the meaning of heritage. It's not only architecture or artifacts that are representing history. It's these memories and ancestral connection to the place.
So in case you didn't hear it in the back, the Temple of Bel was first used as a church, then as a mosque, but also fascinatingly as a birth clinic. So this was a woman whose mother was born in one of the temples. And yes, so the scene on the left looks like an archaeological site. It's a site of the sciences, the end of civilization that we save for the future. But it is also a place where life began, not in the ancient, but in the recent past for other people, on whose labor and skill archaeological excavators relied to remove the objects they coveted even before they even knew what they are. And I could now go back to the civilized, uncivilized museum. So we go circular, but I will leave it here now. Thank you.